Tulane Future Management Board. Please be seated. The session will begin when you tell. A reminder that Tulane University promotes and protects the free exchange of ideas. Freedom of expression includes the ability to engage or not to engage in exchange, examination, and discussion of ideas. It does not include the right to disrupt the freedom of others. Therefore, it prohibits the physical or virtual destruction, shouting down, blocking, or suppressing a protest, demonstration, program, or an invited speaker's right to speak. Please note that disruptions of this nature may result in rule from the event.
Good morning and welcome to Tulane University. It is my pleasure to introduce our next session, Global Port Cities, Common Challenges, Creative Approaches. If time allows, at the end of the session, the panel will take questions submitted by the audience. To submit a question, please use the QR code located on the screens. Please be sure to silence your cell phones. Enjoy the conversation, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our moderator, Brian T. Edwards, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and the Herb Weil Professor of the Humanities.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for coming out here. I will warn you that it's a little bit like being on Broadway. There's so much lights that we're looking to make eye contact, but we may look a little hazy-eyed at times because of the lights. But I am thrilled to be hosting this panel and bringing together a really not only star-studded, but really interesting combination of people to talk about this theme of global port cities within the context of the Tulane Energy Forum. First, let me introduce these fabulous speakers a little bit more than their names, and then we'll get into the conversation. To my immediate left, Emily Federer is the Director of Sustainable Development at the Port of New Orleans, where she has worked for more than a decade, leading projects focused on reducing pollution and community impacts. Emily is a vice chair of the American Association of Port Authorities Environment Committee, an Institute of Sustainable Infrastructure, Envision's sustainability professional, and a certified maritime port executive. And I'm really thrilled to have her here today. Sitting next to Emily is John Sabo, who is a professor here at Tulane in the Department of Coastal and River Science and Engineering, and the director of Tulane's Bywater Institute, which is a research institute at Tulane dedicated to creating transdisciplinary and transformative research that advances resilience of water resources in New Orleans, the Mississippi River Basin, and in tropical river basins in the developing world. And far away from me over there is Alex Kolker. Dr. Alexander Kolker is an oceanographer and a climate scientist with global experience, much of it related to climate change in the coastal zone. He is also an associate professor at the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, and runs also the Coastal Climates Institute, which is a consultancy focused on finding practical solutions to address climate change. And so now, thank you for coming to this panel. In grouping and approaching this big topic through a focus on global port cities, we want to say something about what we're doing and why port cities are interesting to think about together, and also the word global in this, why to think about New Orleans, the Gulf South region in a global context, and that's our goal here. In doing so, we're stepping back to consider what New Orleans as a port city and the Gulf South have in common with other global port cities. For the past several years, and I was really honored to be asked to put together a panel on this topic by the organizers who've been hearing about research that John and I have also been doing together in Vietnam and other cities. But for the past several years, I've been leading a multi-sited project based in New Orleans, Tangier, Morocco, Dakar in Senegal, Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and more recently Salvador, Brazil, and Marseille, France, among others. And it's sometimes a surprising group of cities, but that's exactly kind of the point. The premise of this larger project is that port cities have certain characteristics in common, both positive and negative, or challenges, that makes them worth comparing and putting in dialogue. So on the negative axis, to start with the challenges, port cities have common struggles wherever they are. Very frequently, sustainability and challenges, risk to environmental change, public health challenges, forms of crime and corruption, many of which that can be endemic to modern or contemporary cities that have emerged in places in cities that were founded or established centuries ago around different modes of global trade. On the positive axis, and we're very positive people, they tend to have characteristics in common that make them extraordinary and worth being proud of and thinking about, such as they're extremely multilingual cities in different ways than other inland cities. They're very often multinational or relational across groups or communities in ways that are very special. And perhaps most important, they are highly creative cities where the arts flourish. Now, those of us who live in New Orleans or this area will smile with recognition, but it's not uncommon that port cities have been places where there's globally recognized arts movements, either in the present or the past. Culinary creativity, of course, we're very proud of that here, but it's, again, in most port cities, you see this kind of coming together of different traditions and particularly good food. And what we've been theorizing as something called everyday creativity. Living in a port city is a special place, and they should be more in dialogue. So finally, and there's something that's noticeable, again noticeable here, in some ways this forum, a commitment to port cities by their supporters, by their partisans, by those who live in them is really noteworthy. People are really fighting for these places, for places to live and for their futures. So, and before I get to my questions, a comparative approach or a global approach to port cities recognizes that creative solutions to common challenges faced by port cities are not always the same challenges in every port city, can be enhanced by dialogue and comparison. So, these very creative people have been helping us think through this, and I'm eager to have conversations. I've been talking to them for years in some cases. So we really want to think about these types of questions: sustainability, climate adaptation, and ways that creative cities, such as New Orleans and other port cities, yield different kinds of approaches to our common future. Let me open up this conversation, start the dialogue with Alex, and ask you, Alex, just to start with energy, the theme of our forum, what is the relationship between ports and energy? And how do our port complexes relate to energy systems, both here in Louisiana and elsewhere?
Great question, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel, and huge thanks to people at the Tulane Energy Forum for putting this on. There is a strong relationship between our ports and our energy systems, right? And we see that here in the Gulf. Right, a lot of the world's energy, particularly the world's fossil energy, moves about the world on boats, and then those boats get on and offloaded at ports. And so if you look here, both here in Louisiana and globally, a lot of what goes on at the port, or ports in general, is moving energy back and forth, or moving fossil fuel products back and forth. The Mississippi River, as we all know, is the largest pathway for commerce in the country, at least by weight. And about half of what moves up and down the lower Mississippi River is somehow energy or fossil energy related. It's oil, gas, coal, refined products, petrochemicals, or heavy energy intensive products like fertilizer. But of course, that's not just the United States. If you look across the world, you look at ports, Rotterdam, you look at the Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Pearl River Delta in China. If you look at the world ports, you'll often see fossil energy infrastructure near the ports. And so that is a key link. And of course, many of these areas are on the front lines of climate change and dealing with threats of extreme storms, rising sea levels, increased flooding, in some ways similar to what we have in Louisiana and in some ways different.
John, why don't you pick up on that last comment? I mean, what are some of the broad climate challenges that are faced by port cities? And you talk about any of them, but especially I know you've been working in Vietnam and the Mekong River Delta region, Saigon, for some time.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I think some context is necessary. We live in New Orleans here, and it's a port city, and it's the mouth of the Mississippi River, which drains 31 U.S. states. And so when we think about impacts of climate change here, we have to think about it in a systems perspective that includes that whole watershed. And I like to think of the potential impacts, the transformations that climate change is bringing to the Mississippi Basin as being in 5 categories, and I call them dry, hot, stormy, salty, and sick, right? And I'm writing a book about this, so it kind of just rolls off my tongue like that. But if we think about the core of those, especially the dry, the stormy, and the salty, those are all water-related climate change issues, right? Sea level rise, storm intensity is increasing, and importantly, and we don't think about this in Louisiana, half the basin is in the arid west, and it's getting drier, and acidification is moving east. And as we saw 2 years ago and 3 years ago, the river was at record low levels, right? And that impacted our water security here. It also impacted the way the output from the port, right? Because barge traffic was slowed down by low flows in the Mississippi River. So point number one is we have to really think about it in a basin perspective, not just locally, but locally it's also, many of those same impacts are also very relevant locally, especially the stormy piece and the salty piece, which is, ports need water, right? And when you build infrastructure, you build it with certain expectations about what that water is going to be. Is it going to be salty? Is it going to be fresh, right? And I like to say that New Orleans is a freshwater city. We're the Mississippi River city, the Crescent city, but we're soon to be a saltwater city. And that's really going to change the way we view not just how ports maybe operate, and you could talk more about that, but also just how the city's culture rallies around that in future years to adapt to those kinds of changes. And we can get to that in later questions, I think.
That's really interesting. I do want to talk more about that. But let me bring Alex into the conversation and ask you about how ports are being impacted by climate change and sea level rise, and also how you see further accelerations in storm intensity and warming and so on impact our ports and the people who depend on them.
Mm-hmm. So something that we're always looking at is the fluctuation of the Mississippi River, as John said, and the low river, we have to dredge a lot. There's a lot of sediments that accrue along the wharves, so that's something that we constantly have to look at. Something that people don't always think about when they're looking at the Port of New Orleans, in particular, our wharves are actually some of the highest locations in the city. So from a flooding impact perspective, we're not always as concerned about that, because of the nature of the city being a bowl.
Right.
But there is, the intensity of the storms that we have to look at. So when we're building our new infrastructure, how are we going to build it with greater resilience? How are we going to build it stronger?
Right.
Yeah.
Alex, let me ask you to enhance on this question too, from your perspective, marine science.
Well, you know what, I think to start off with, let's just think about what you're at the Port of New Orleans, but maybe more broadly in South Louisiana. You're certainly, the Port of New Orleans is a huge player, but they're not the only player in this system, right? And there's the Port of South Louisiana that includes a whole bunch of other ports up and down the river. And so if you think there's, what is formerly the Port of New Orleans that's here in New Orleans, but this is also part of a much larger port complex that in some ways many ways is based here, but you can also think of it more broadly as extending, almost from Mobile all the way over through to Texas, right? And there are port complexes all across the Gulf Coast, and that includes here in New Orleans, but it also includes places like Lake Charles, places like Beaumont and Houston and Galveston. And so there's a whole port complex over here in the Gulf. And some places are higher ground than others, but across the entire coast, we are dealing with all sorts of issues related to climate change, increased flooding, increased sea level rise. And of course, some places are in more resilient places than others, or higher ground than others. But there is, of course, the Port of New Orleans is a big player, but let's not forget there's a lot of other players in the port complex as well.
Before I move into the realm of creativity, I know you've done work, Alex, in West Africa and Morocco, and John, you've got this work in Vietnam. What do you see just on the level of these kinds of questions, whether it's sustainability questions, before we get to creativity in these radically different locations?
Yeah, I think you see shared commonalities that across the world ports are both exceedingly important. They're exceedingly important for global trade. Much of the world's economy depends on ports, and much of many goods. We've heard about supply chain disruptions. Those all at somewhere involve a port. So ports are incredibly important for global economy. Port cities, a lot of people live in port cities, as you mentioned, so these are critically important. Ports also play a role in our global security system. I actually did a fellowship recently with NATO, National North Atlantic Treaty Organization, set up a climate center, and I did a fellowship with them, and I talked a little bit about the impacts of climate change on ports and military-related ports in the Arctic. So we are seeing a general concern about climate change in coastal areas in general. And, Louisiana is a great, case study because water levels are rising faster in Louisiana. Plus, it's a very large port. It's got a long history. So lessons learned here are in some ways applicable globally, or at least if they're not directly globally, one for one, it's a great jumping off point for a conversation, regardless of how you look at this system port systems around the world.
Yeah.
I have a little bit to add to that. I work in two international contexts, one in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, where we went together, and also in Mexico, mostly in Mexico City, but I want to point out that the port in Veracruz is a Gulf port, and so a lot of the lessons learned, I think, are transferable, like Alex was saying. I think in Vietnam it's a little bit different. It is a freshwater port, right? There are tides that bring salt water pretty close, but it's a city of, for one, it's a city of 12 million people, which is much bigger than New Orleans. And it sits at the confluence of two rivers, which flood a lot. And I think I don't know if it's too early to get into the solution space, but one thing that I'm always impressed by in Vietnam, and especially in Ho Chi Minh City, is that they're grappling with this idea of living with water instead of trying to keep it out of the city, which is really important, I think, because the magnitude of the floods there and also the frequency is really high. And I think they don't have the levee system that we have on the Mississippi, and they're trying to figure out if they build levees maybe on one side but not on the other, and leave floodplains within the city to absorb some of that flood water in a way that they're living with with water in a way that we're trying to do since Katrina here in New Orleans. So I think there are some similarities there. The scale, though, is just so much bigger and impressive.
I want to build on the question about salt water. I'm really fascinated with water, and of course, being in port cities, I think we live with water, or our perspective on water is very different on a day-to-day level than living in other big cities. I lived for a long time in Chicago, and I didn't think about water really at all. And I don't want to take that lightly. I think that focusing on ports, and Emily, you're going to help me with this a little bit, makes us start to conceive of water very differently. Even though you say New Orleans is a freshwater city, and it's got to start thinking about itself as a saltwater city, and I'm like, ooh, what is that? I mean, I know you mean that from a engineering into coastals, but it seems bigger than that. What would it mean to be a saltwater city for New Orleans? So, and John, just one last question for you on the work in Vietnam, or a follow-up. You work on sea level rise, and you spend a lot of time on the water. I had the opportunity to spend time on the water with you for several hours. What does the port city look like from the water perspective, whether it's rising or flowing, saltwater or freshwater? How do you think of it as someone who's a scientist in this realm?
Well, it's a great question, because we spent 3 or 4 hours on the water in Can Tho, near the mouth of the Mekong River in Vietnam. And my main goal for that trip was to see how people live and whether they're high enough to live sustainably with 1 meter change in sea level rise, right? And the answer was, no, they're going to have to move, all of them. And so, like, if we think about the situation here, and Alex, you can help me out with the exact numbers, but I think, on the extreme end, forecasts for 2050 have us somewhere between 1/2 meter and 1 meter of sea level rise, and much higher 2100. I don't ever talk about 2100 because I won't be alive in 2100, but 2050 is around the corner, right? And so a lot of the scenarios put the edge of the ocean in Baton Rouge, right? Which means that we are a city that's basically a castle surrounded by a moat, and that's a saltwater city. And so I think it's hard to grapple with that notion, but I mean, you can go and look at NOAA's sea level rise viewer and play with scenarios and see what it looks like. That changes the way we do shipping. That changes the way we bring things in and cook our own culture here, I think.
All right, so Emily, let's go to the creativity part of this conversation that I really want to foreground. So panelists here, as I'm admiringly aware, have backgrounds in science, and the creativity that scientists bring into their work, it may or may not be the way that we use the word in the arts and in other parts of the humanities. So how is but I want to, of course, trouble that notion, as we say, and I learned a lot from traveling with John. How is creativity important that the work that you're doing at the Port of New Orleans, and what helps you build your creativity when we think about approaches to these challenges?
Yeah, I think, when you're tackling big challenges, big ideas, and big projects, it's something that, from a scientific perspective or an engineering perspective, we might be able to identify, how things have been done, what science goes into it, but really the collaboration and getting messages out to really get the bigger things done is something that isn't taught with backgrounds in science and engineering, and getting together with organizations like nonprofits and the universities and other the city and other public agencies around the area that have to collaborate. That's not something that they always teach you when you come from a hard science background. And I think that's something that we all have to learn to do outside of our traditional education and growing through our careers. It starts to build. And then another thing I want to...
How do we do, just to interrupt, what are your thoughts about how we do that? I mean, one way is, of
Yeah.
course, conversations across disciplines, we would say in the university, but across sectors, bringing people together who don't usually talk. But, I mean, what's working for you, or what's sparking that?
I mean, just really communicating with other people, like you said. My upbringing, I was actually raised by an artist and a musician, so I kind of had some of that creative spark through my childhood. But going into the sciences, it, wasn't really built up there. But yeah, communicating, working with people that are outside your own discipline, and working to get projects done. Something that we did a few years ago, and I see Sharon in the room, and I know that she talked about this with me, but we did some art projects around storm drains to emphasize the importance of water quality and what's going down those drains. So bringing attention outside of the traditional pamphlets of scientific information or city and port information to something that's more visible in the public's eye.
I want to come back and ask you more examples from the work you're doing at Port of New Orleans. But Alex, what lessons or in resilience and climate resilience can Louisiana share with port cities elsewhere in the world?
I think we've got a lot of lessons that we can share globally.
Yeah.
We've learned a lot. We've done a lot of things well in Louisiana. We've obviously made some huge mistakes in Louisiana. We just passed the 20th anniversary of Katrina, which was a colossal mess, and people can learn from that. So I think, broadly speaking, people in Louisiana have been dealing with climate change, sea level rise, flooding, land loss, a host of issues around Louisiana, around flooding, around water, and we've been dealing with it in some pretty intense ways. And clearly the state of Louisiana has done a lot right, and the area has also done a lot wrong. And I think people can learn a lot of these lessons. So the state of Louisiana has long had its master plan for coastal restoration, which was a very science and engineering based plan that looked at a set of scenarios and tried to find the projects that built the most land and reduced the most flood risk in a very analytical and scientific way, something that was done very right. I can't talk about that thing right now and talk about the fact that one of the major projects was just canceled, and that was a huge setback. But the state of Louisiana has been doing a lot, whether that's the scientific community here at Tulane or at some of the other great universities in the area, whether that's in the private sector. There's a lot of engineering firms and think tanks that have been thinking about it. There's a lot of NGOs in the area, people that have been advocating for coastal issues. And so if you look at that as an ecosystem, as a sort of a water thinking ecosystem between universities, the private sector, the public sector, there are a lot of things that have been done here. Some have been done great, some have not. But all of them are exceedingly valuable lessons.
So this is good. There's two kind of vectors that I'm teasing out here. One is this conversation across scientific communities, let's say broadly speaking, and creative communities, whatever that might mean to you, and that sometimes that conversation will spark solutions or approaches that might not have come about before. I want to tell a story about John and my trip to Vietnam that is going to come back to what you just said. And the other thing I'm teasing out is that there's some communities in other port cities around the world, or around the United States. I just came back from Seattle, and thanks to Emily's introduction, met with some really interesting people at the Port of Seattle and learning what they're thinking about, what they're doing, and the pressures that they're feeling. Very different in a way from what I understand to be the pressures here. But that kind of dialogue can lead to other sorts of conversations. So here's the little story. So John and I, it was an experiment. I like experiments. We said, he's been working in Vietnam for a long time. This Port Cities project had led me to be really interested in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and he had to travel there, I had to travel there. We said, why don't we travel at the same time and overlap for a few days, and I'll take you to my world while I try to do my work, which was going to be in these creative communities, and then you take me to your world and show me what you see as a scientist, as someone who works on water and coasts. And just an experiment to see. And, you know, researchers look at the world, sometimes the same world, through very different lenses, and they end up looking at different things as a result. It was actually, I think, a very successful experiment, and now we're collaborating on a paper on a word that we didn't think was a word we would define so differently. It's a word that Alex was just using, and it's a word we use here a lot, and the word was resilience. Resilience can mean a lot of different things, depending on your community, your intellectual community, your discursive community, whatever. And so I'll let actually John tell the rest of the story, but this is let's talk about the word resilience for a bit here. In my question to Alex, what were the lessons about resilience that New Orleans could tell could be answered from a science perspective, but it could mean different things depending on a different perspective. You want to take up the story?
Sure. I mean, I'm so glad you told that longer story. Lots of fun, that trip. And before I go into resilience, I just wanted to say that, you know, one thing for me that was really insightful is we were talking about sort of the design of your comparative study. And I was thinking to myself, we've got a lot of these port cities that are French colonial, and some of them aren't. So, you know, my first intuition as I'm trained as an experimental ecologist. My first intuition was, okay, well, we need a balanced design. We need to have 4 of each, and we need to be able to compare them, right? And then we had a back and forth about, you know, whether that was appropriate or not, and I think I learned a lot from that about sort of how you go about doing research in humanities, which I don't have a background in. So that was really interesting. Still think we need a balanced design, but we should come back to that later. Resilience, I like to say, and this I'm kind of borrowing from my colleague Jessica Dandridge on this, I like to say that resilience isn't enough. Resilience is like surviving, right? We're resilient here in New Orleans. We survived. I was not here for Katrina, so I can't claim this, but I was here for Ida. And I would say that communities in general survived Katrina. Some of them learned how to thrive again, and thriving should be the goal rather than surviving. So I use resilience hesitantly as a term when I'm talking about adaptation to climate change. What components lead to a thriving community? I think culture is right at the heart of it, right? Music, food, art. Art is a communication tool for what people are feeling as they're trying to thrive in their communities. And then more broadly, just the fabric that's created in communities, in interpersonal relationships and families. And a lot of times we hear, okay, so I came here from Phoenix. In Phoenix, often people say, why is there a city of 3 million people in the desert where there's no water, right? Then I moved here. And here I have the same chorus, right? It's like, why is there a sinking city that we subsidize? We just had a Atlantic headline that was like that, right? Why do people still live there? And I would say that the answer is this culture piece that includes the fabric of interpersonal relationships and families. That's really hard to move and replicate, right? So like, if the answer is don't have the city there, which I don't think the answer is, then you need to figure out how to move that part and parcel, like whole cloth, to a new place, which is very hard to do. And I think most people who left to Houston and Nashville and Atlanta during Katrina found that was really hard to do, right? So they came back because they had it here. So I think when I think about resilience, I want to take it a step further to thriving, not just surviving. And the culture piece is really important for thriving.
Emily, I want to ask you a little bit more about your work with the Port of New Orleans, the work you're doing, and how have you leveraged this kind of port city creativity where now describing whether to communicate pressing scientific problems or environmental issues or to complete big projects, or how does it, and say a little bit more about the work you're doing because it's really interesting. Yeah.
I actually would like to follow up a little bit on what John was talking
please.
about. You know, the resiliency piece and the community coming together and you know, going beyond just coming back, but thriving. And I think a big piece of that is, the economy of that, and having the port here in New Orleans, and the relationship between those things. And the Port of New Orleans has been an entity in the state government since 1893, but this area has been open for trade much longer than that. Before it was even colonized, it was a central location for trade because of its location and access for water commerce. Now we have rail commerce that reaches Mexico, Canada, and to both coasts, unlike any other port. And I think that is really something that is going to make New Orleans culture and population continue to be resilient and sustainable into the future, because having this nexus here at the bottom of the Mississippi River opens up the entire country for trade, and the interconnectedness between the other port cities and New Orleans. And something we were talking about before the panel today was getting beyond that, coming back to just surviving, building on our education and our access to food and our access to our housing. The basic needs, once those are met, then we can start to really thrive. And I think when we're continually being knocked down, so to say, it makes it more difficult to really thrive and build on the cultural aspects. But that's what makes the quality of life here even better.
Just before I push you on the other work that you're doing, that comment you made that even the physical space of this city and the place where this confluence of waters leads people to settle even before the French and the Spanish kind of colonial moments. Many people know here that the word for this space before the French called it after a city in central France, Nouvelle-Orléans, was Bulbancha. I'm sure most of you have heard this word by now. This Chickasaw word, Choctaw name for this place. You may know that the meaning of that word, the translation of that word into English, is place of other tongues, or place of many tongues. And the suggestion there is that this was a place where people of different tongues or different languages or different nations, or nations wouldn't be the right formation then, but came together to trade, and so that it would be referred to as the place where there would be multiple languages. So I've always found that really fascinating, because New Orleans of today is such a rich linguistic environment and a rich multinational environment. But as you indicated, then it becomes really interesting to think of the physical space and confluence of waters as that continues to change, whether it becomes salt water or whether sea level rise changes the places within it. So anyway, that's really fascinating. All right, so tell me, but that's a really good comment on the other thing.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more how you've been using, let's say, leveraging these kind of forms of creativity?
So one of the projects that we're working on, many people know, we're working on constructing a new port terminal in St. Bernard Parish. That project has been challenging. I think any big infrastructure project can be challenging, but we are constructing it because of the need to have a container terminal downriver from the Crescent City Connection Bridge, which provides a height limitation for the ships to come in to the Port of New Orleans. So if this terminal is not constructed, it's going to be a huge limiting factor to what can move forward in terms of commerce for the city, in terms of trade, in terms of how we're still connected to our countries and cities around the world and upriver inland. But the creativity aspect of that, we've had to partner with a lot of different aspects, not just with different municipalities and agencies, but with the community. We work closely with some of the workforce development partners, with nonprofits like the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development. Working with organizations, and just talking to people, like Alex and I were talking beforehand about the Studio in the Woods. He's has some relationship with that organization and you know, the science and
A
art
wonderful
aspect of
Tulane
that. Yes.
center
It's
within
beautiful,
John's
too.
Bywater Institute, yeah.
Yes, and it sits in John's Bywater Institute. I serve on the board, but it's a great place that brings artists and scientists together. And often a lot of artists do things on themes of the environment, on themes related to environment, sustainability, climate. And I think, you know, artists, organizations like that have the opportunity to tell the story of climate change or environmental change in a way that's very different from what scientists do, right? As a scientist, I'm in some ways limited, right? Because I have to stick to what the data says. If you make projections about the future, you're very much constrained with what the projections can be based on, you know, very physical scenarios. Artists have the ability to think more broadly and say things in a way that scientists can't say. And so I think that there are some similarities between arts and sciences, and that we often are thinking about a changing landscape. We're often trying to describe the landscape, but artists have tools that as scientists we don't have. So I think that there is a lot there. It's why I think it's great that Tulane, you know, sponsors this studio in the woods, and it's been an honor and Bywater obviously sits within John's Institute. It's been an honor to serve on the board of that.
I mean, and just to say one last thing about that, and having visited the studio in the woods a few times, some of the artists or some of the creative people are writers of different kinds and using different formats and genres and making up new ones at the same time. I found some really, and it's, you know, the telling of the story or the narratives that we use to talk about any of the topics we're talking about today, resilience, you know, energy, port, you know, these are stories that, and it is true that humans understand through narrative and through stories, and that when we tell a story, we communicate differently. And I think that's something that I've noticed some of the work that's being done of the writers. By the way, and this is the old literature professor in me, I haven't been in the classroom for a while, so many of our great works of literature relate to the sea or relate to the journey on the river. Huckleberry Finn is the most obvious example as one of the greatest of American novels that could not exist without the river itself, but it goes back to Homer. But in any case, so the narratives are that kind of thing. By the way, I did say, or someone said up on stage, our moderator, that there is time and space for questions, and I'm hoping we're provoking you. I don't get to see hands, but I know I get to see a screen. So I asked the person in the back, have you received any questions? Yes, I heard.
We have one question.
Would you like to pose it on behalf of the person who QR coded it to you?
Sure. How can we best approach the challenges of balancing our various critical needs from the Mississippi River, including navigation for commerce, flood risk management, drinking water, and sustaining the coastal wetlands to keep us safe?
Okay, I had a little acoustics issues with that. Did you all hear that?
I missed the beginning.
Yeah.
Would you just say it one more time, there's a reverb, a little bit slower?
How can we best approach the challenges of balancing our various critical needs from the Mississippi River, including navigation for commerce, flood risk management, drinking water, and sustaining the coastal wetlands to keep us safe?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by answering that. I think that there's a huge role that science has to play in answering those questions. Science is very good at quantifying our modern system and then also making a series of projections of what the future will be, and it allows us to make quantitative decisions about how to structure the future. If you look at the state's master plan that's still in effect, the state's master plan took a very quantitative analysis of of current scenarios and future scenarios, including climate change, sea level rise, as well as changes in the river's hydrology, to select the projects that were going to best rebuild the landscape and reduce flood risks. It's not a plan that is perfect, in every situation. And as we know, one major project in that plan was recently canceled. But overall, it was a science and knowledge-based framework that selected the projects that were going to best reduce risk and best build land. Wasn't going to reduce risk entirely, wasn't going to rebuild the entire state, but it was going to do the best job with the tools and constraints that we had.
I like that answer. I want to go back to, I guess, my first set of comments, which was, you got to remember that we're at the mouth of the Mississippi, and the Mississippi drains 31 U.S. states. Okay, let's hold that thought for a sec. I like to think about adaptation as having four critical components that are interwoven. And this happened to a certain extent after Katrina here in New Orleans and in Louisiana, which led to the creation of the CPRA and coastal restoration here. And those four components are built infrastructure, natural infrastructure, cyber infrastructure, so data systems to manage that infrastructure to perform well, and then most importantly, social infrastructure, right? We need those four to be coordinated in a way, in some ways in novel ways, and that's what happened after Katrina, which I think is a really good outcome from that natural disaster. So we need that. Back to the basin scale, we don't have that for 31 US states, right? And so I think a lot of times when we think about adaptation and resilience, we think, what fence are we going to build around our property or around our city to defend us from all these external forces, right? And that's important, but it's also important to coordinate, especially in the context of a big river basin that has 31 US states that are contributing water to it. So when we think about the lack of water that impacted barge traffic and water security in New Orleans, that's a basin scale problem. That requires coordination with other states and other institutions in other states to build infrastructure, the other three kinds of things, cyber, natural, built, in other places that might benefit us. So that's the sort of thing that we need to be thinking about and we don't have a structure for right now.
I would add on to that maybe, and I know there was like a list of things that were there, the coastal sediments, the water access, the navigation that were listed in the question. I don't think they're exclusive to each other. I think they all work together. It's one system, and as John was saying, the 31 states that drain down here, they're carrying sediments that are building our coast. They're which we dredge from the port to maintain berthing depth for our ships. That sediment isn't being taken out of the river; it's being pushed downriver. So it's continuing to move down to hopefully help build those sediment traps, and it could hopefully continue to to do some of the diversion projects in the future. And then the drainage coming down and the saltwater intrusion that will be exacerbated by sea level rise. If we're continuing to see less precipitation, that's going to cause lower flow, and I think that's where the future saltwater city would be coming from, and that does have a lot of implications across the south side of the state.
Great. Well, we are at our time for our panel, and before I ask you to help me thank these panelists, I'll promo a couple of things if you're interested in this topic further. One is we have launched this week at Tulane, the Tulane Global Humanities Center, and its theme for the next 2 years is focusing around global port cities. So a lot of events, including a 2-day symposium on January 22nd and 23rd here on campus that I invite you all to, as well as events throughout the year. There's an article that I co-authored on port cities that talks about some of these kind of topics. Short article if you're interested in the journal Public Culture, which came out recently, which you can find also on our website. And I really find the dialogue and learning from Alex, learning from John, learning from Emily to be really productive for more creative thinking. And I love these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations that the Energy Forum and that Tulane is really foregrounding in general, to really come together and think creatively, think strategically together for all of our futures and this good work here in the future of energy and the future of this city and region. So please join me in thanking Emily Federer, John Sabo, and Alex Kolker for sharing with us their wisdom today.
Thank you for joining us for this session. Our next session in this space will be Forging the Future Grid, a dialogue on resilience, flexibility, and AI, which is scheduled to start at 11:10.